This is Finding God from Parish Life Connect.
Do holidays have any transformative meaning in our celebration of them as we journey in our walk with Christ to become more like Him? How can we find the deeper meaning and connect with it so it's not just some mental abstraction or exercise that doesn't land anywhere in our lives? Hello and welcome to Finding God. I'm Nolan Brown, and on today's episode, we're going to have a conversation with a good friend of mine, Luke Harris. Luke did not grow up as a Christian, so he has a different perspective on what it's like to celebrate holidays from a non-religious view, as well as from a Christian perspective. I hope you enjoy. All right, well, thanks, Luke, for joining me on the podcast today to talk about something really that's been near and dear to your journey with Christ. And you kind of brought this to me as we were discussing different topics around, the meaning of our faith and how to delve deeper. But holidays, they're called holy days. That's where we get the word. But what's on your heart on that?
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me on.
Sure.
I appreciate it. This is my first time being on a podcast or anything, so it's a little nerve-wracking, but it's all right. I'll do my best. So yeah, you're right. I brought this to you because it's something that, as we just wrapped up Holy Week and our Easter celebration, Pascha, it just was a profound experience for me. And it made me reflect a lot on just my journey to Christ, and which started for me about 14 years ago.
Right, because you haven't always been Christian. I grew up Christian, was in it from birth, didn't know anything else, but you've had a different perspective that often growing up, I was envious of people who had come from, you could say, the world and found Christ and then entered the church. But tell us more about that and what your perspective was on holidays and how those worked for you there.
Yeah. So, I grew up in a non-religious family, I guess you would call it.
Sure.
My dad's lineage was Jewish, but there was no observation of that. And my mom grew up Lutheran, but also no real observation of that in my life. They both were kind of, 60s hippies and, did that whole thing. Okay. But we did celebrate Christmas and Easter.
Right.
And Christmas in particular was this big deal. I loved Christmas as a kid. Santa Claus would come. And
right.
I wouldn't be able to sleep at night, and I would try to I would write notes Santa Claus, give me this toy, or, do this thing for me so that I know that you're real, or, whatever. I do all that kind of stuff. And we would even go to church. I was Joseph in a nativity play.
Oh, wow. So you had
I was 5.
Probably because of your mom's Lutheran background, there was still some Christian influence into the traditions that were practiced around the holiday of Christmas.
And I think generally in America, right? It's still
true.
kind of at the roots in many ways of this country, at least from certain perspectives. I think a lot of people that celebrate Christmas probably still go to church maybe on Christmas Eve or something, and
they may not know why necessarily. It may just be like, hey, we show up, we do this thing, and it's about Jesus, I guess. It has Christ in the name, but beyond that, okay.
Yeah, and that was something that was kind of confusing to me as a kid. I didn't really understand what Santa Claus and Jesus had to do with each other.
Sure.
And why there was never a connection made of this is Santa Claus is doing this thing out of love and generosity because that's how Christ is or whatever. That was never something that was part of it. So as I got older, I got into, obviously at some point I figured out that, Santa Claus wasn't, quote unquote real. And
it's all good. Bumps happen.
Sorry
Bumps
about
happen.
bumping the table there.
We'll get boom mics someday and we won't have to worry about that. We'll slap them in the air or something.
Right, exactly. You were totally right too. You told me that this was going to be a problem, and it already is. I'll try my best not to do that again. But I figured out, Santa Claus isn't real. And so then Christmas started to become this what's exciting about this for me? I guess getting stuff. I'm excited about getting, new Nintendo 64 games or, dating myself there.
Good old N64 one. Good times with that.
And then, I was always trying to drum up that excitement. I wanted things to be just like they were when I was a kid. We had to have this specific Christmas meal that we always had on Christmas Eve, and go to church, of course, because the candlelight service was so great. Whatever. Right. It was just part of the whole thing for me.
The nostalgia of it, really.
And that, I think that is exactly what it became. It was just trying to relive the excitement and joy that I had as a kid around that holiday.
Yeah.
And so fast forward a little bit, and I have a conversion experience in college and become, start trying to pursue my faith as a Christian. And after that, I was trying to figure out like, well, how does my experience of Christmas growing up like jive with like now I'm a Christian.
Sure.
And this holiday is about the birth of Christ. And unfortunately, I honestly, Christmas became a real like tough situation for me as an early believer, because what I saw was that the celebrating of Christmas in the quote unquote Christian world was basically the same as what I grew up with as a non-religious, I guess we could use the word secular, person doing the Santa Claus thing.
Yeah.
It was a lot of people, still incorporate Santa. A lot of Christians incorporate Santa Claus, which, whatever, that's not what this is about, whether that's a good or a bad thing. But again, the whole point really became about, the getting of presents on Christmas morning.
Interesting.
And, having a meal either on Christmas Eve or Christmas night, and going
So
to
largely,
a candlelight
largely
service.
the same practices.
Yeah.
Not really
Yeah.
much changed at all, and that left you kind of puzzling why. And it's,
Yeah.
I think it kind of touches on a deeper dilemma that we have. I mean, especially in our Western approach to things, of things really being about head knowledge. And one of them, I heard it said one time that the greatest distance in the universe is between one's head and their heart, and like trying to get these things into their heart. And for me, growing up, there was no real guidance, and it's one of the primary reasons that this podcast has been started is finding God in everything. He's everywhere present. He fills all things. How do we find him? It's not God that needs to enter our presence. It's us who needs to enter his, which is the present, the reality.
Right.
So we've used the word present a lot, especially with the presents for Christmas. But I think there's something to that, this deeper recognition that a lot of times God and the church and the practices of our holidays stay in our head, and we might understand something now. So maybe the only thing that shifted really is the movement from the reason for the season, you could say, the rationalized reason for that season being, instead of it being just about Santa Claus, now it was about the gift that Christ gave us. And none of that is quote unquote wrong. It's accurate, but the lived experience of it didn't really change much. The same practices or traditions were there, but they didn't necessarily have any kind of impact in the lived experience, is what I'm hearing.
Yes, exactly. And that was just a struggle for me. And I think intuitively understood that commemorating, remembering, reenacting, whatever you want to call the nativity, because it is a very important piece of the whole story of our existence and the universe. That it was important to give some attention to that and to celebrate that. But it just seemed so wrong that it had been so commercialized, I guess, in some ways. I don't know, whatever you want to call that.
I mean, C.S. Lewis harps on this pretty hard, right? He calls it Xmas, I think. It's like, it's no longer Christ. It's Xmas.
Yeah.
And I think it's a pretty modern rant, I guess you could say, in Christianity, to say, the reason for the season.
Keep Christ in Christmas and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
And at the same time, what does that actually look like to live that out?
And I had no idea, right?
Yeah.
I didn't know what that meant. And so there's this understanding that like, this is important. We should, obviously, and because we all still do, even people who aren't professing Christians celebrate Christmas. Like it's stuck in our memory, in our cultural memory.
Yeah.
But it just seems very detached from what it is meant to be. And maybe this is a deeper thing about like, do we even know how to actually celebrate something anymore when, it feels like most of our lives are kind of aimed at just like this giant festival, eat as much as you can, consume as much as you can, always party, Mardi Gras without Lent, or,
Right.
whatever. It's like
Yeah.
it's Mardi Gras every day in New Orleans or something.
I think you said something that touches on this pretty profoundly earlier when you were describing your non-religious experience of Christmas, of even, trying to make it as exciting as possible, or trying to like relive those moments of nostalgia that really just were trying to conjure up the emotionalism or the experience of it in that regard as really the only thing to hold on to. And I think this really touches on a deeper struggle that we have in our modern society of the meaning of life. Like, why are we even alive in the first place? Like, what is it that we're supposed to do on this earth between our birth and our death that has any meaning? And unfortunately, I think a lot of us end up chasing happiness or chasing the positive experience. And that almost makes it we can't embrace suffering. We can't embrace sorrow. We can't struggle with any of the dark or the negative, what we perceive as negative sides of life. And I think that manifests itself in our holidays because we've kind of taken the holy out of the holiday, if you will. We've made it more of a opportunity to try to go get a little bit of life in. Like, hey, it's Memorial Day again. Like, let's have another barbecue. Let's have some fun. Let's have some friends over, drink beer, and play cornhole or whatever it is. But are we really reconnecting with the reason that day was set aside to memorialize, the veterans who lost their lives in war, or, and all of the various things that go with it, and any other holiday for that matter? It's it just really digs deeper into this question of why are we here in the first place, I think. And if you go back to like what Christianity tells us, the reason we're here is to repent. Right. Which is the call of Christ. He says, repent for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. So it's to repent and to become like Christ, to be transformed and to go into the world and to be Christ to all people, to love one another. And that's a journey of transformation. And so then within the Christian world, these holidays are moments of an opportunity to be recalled back into this ongoing theme of transformation. And so you have the incarnation of Christ, which is the nativity, the birth of Jesus, Christmas, huge holiday in Christianity, even beyond because of the influence it's had. But it calls us back to this transformative reality, this practical lived experience of recognizing that Christ did come and join humanity and was born into humanity. I mean, it's huge.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a major historical marker.
Indeed.
The most important one.
Yeah.
I think so. And just kind of getting into like a little bit more into this, the holiday and
Sure.
Christmas and even just, even my journey into Christianity. So as I'm, searching these things out, one of the other things that kind of stuck out to me, especially in the Christian context, is, Easter. And, growing up, again, Easter was, there was a bunny.
Bunnies and eggs. And
it was a magical bunny that hid candy and eggs around my house.
Exactly.
And that's all it was. And it was just kind of like another twist on like Santa Claus almost, really. That's how it was, at least for me growing up. And then coming into the church, into Christianity, it was definitely, and I think people can understand what I'm about to say here, that it feels like it's the subordinate celebration to Christmas, right? Christmas culturally starts early November often, right? And really in earnest the day after Thanksgiving when we all go crazy and, trample each other to buy presents at a store.
Black Friday. You should call it Red Friday for the bloodshed.
And and then it's like, all the commercials, the lights, everything. It's like this big, it's like a whole, at least a month of just, celebrating.
2 months for some of my neighbors. They don't take their lights down for a long
all year. I've got people in my neighborhood that still have Christmas lights up. And then Easter, it's like, oh, it's Easter weekend. I guess we should, wear nice clothes to church and, have a ham. Right?
Well, I wonder if that's not why. I mean, I think there's a couple of things here as to why Easter is the subordinate holiday to Christmas. I think it probably began within the church itself, shifting its priority. And I should probably say, like, different faith confessions do this differently, right? So, like, within Christianity, there's all of these different varieties of beliefs and traditions. And so, but I think predominantly in Western Christianity, we see this shift away from Easter and more towards the Nativity. Maybe even before, we have this cultural suppression of Easter from a secular standpoint, you could say. And I really don't like those terms sacred and secular, but they're useful in conversation. But maybe it's harder to commercialize Easter. Maybe it's harder to make a big
I had that same
thing
thought.
out of it, right? Like, we've got this fantastic opportunity to capitalize on this fat guy in a red suit bringing presents to everybody, and we can kind of leverage people into buying each other a bunch of stuff so we can commercialize and consumerize this thing.
Yep.
Pretty hard to do that with the resurrection of our Lord. Like,
Well, and the crucifixion, because they go hand in hand.
right. There's this solemn and somber aspect, and then the resurrection. It's like nobody wants to talk about death and new life when it comes to dealing with the hard things. Again, this idea of the meaning of our life being about pursuing happiness and chasing pleasure and fleeing pain. It's almost like we want to live with our head in the sand, like we will never die. We're invincible. And I just want to think about that. It's not healthy for me to think about that. I'm just going to stay focused on this. But I think that leaves us in a place where Easter and the resurrection becomes dampened. But I don't know, what your thoughts on?
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I just had this thought about Talladega Nights and Ricky Bobby just being like praying to sweet little 6-pound, 8-ounce baby Jesus. Like, just like, that's funny because it's like, when you think about the centrality that we have placed on Christmas, it's like, yeah, you actually, they're poking fun, but it's making kind of a valid point in some ways.
It's not too wrong.
So, I mean, I had that same thought about Easter not being able to be easily commercialized. And this kind of brings it around to like, how were these holidays, Christmas and Easter in particular, because those are ones that, as Americans, we're all very familiar with.
Sure.
And how those holidays have been celebrated by Christians throughout history,
Right.
From the earliest time, and in some cases all the way up to now.
Yeah.
And, especially Easter or Pascha, which just, we just mean Passover, the Passover of our Lord.
Yeah. And that's a really predominant thing within the Eastern Orthodox tradition is Pascha.
Yes.
Whereas in the West here, we're far more familiar with the Western approach, Roman Catholicism, Protestantism, and that would be Easter.
Yep.
In that sense, two different calendars, different things going on there.
Yep.
But to your point.
But, and this is various traditions within Protestantism, Catholicism, Orthodox, whatever, will understand around the Easter season that there's this time called Lent. And most people understand Lent's a time where you might give some stuff up to increase your devotion, perhaps to lessen distraction. And for me, like having actually entered into a place where that's taken very seriously, there's the whole atmosphere of church services change in order to recognize that we're in this season of mourning and preparation. And from the early times, it was actually Lent was used as like a preparatory period for people who were getting ready to get baptized and enter into the life of Christ.
Yeah.
And so we're in many ways doing that every year. And then you get to Holy Week, which again, the first time I actually ever encountered Holy Week was when I lived in Nicaragua right after college. And there's a lot of Catholicism is pretty predominant down there. And we went traveling during Holy Week because it's for them is like a spring break, and so we were traveling and we went to an old town called Leon, and I think it was on Holy Thursday. I don't remember exactly. But they had their tradition in that town was that they would out of colored sand make murals of the different situations that occurred in Jesus's life during Holy Week. And then they would come out of the church with Christ's body, in a big glass case, and they would process around the town and they would walk through these depictions. It was super fascinating.
Yeah,
I've never seen anything
powerful.
like it. And it left an impression on me for sure. And, at that time, I didn't really know much about the ancient church or Catholicism or anything like that. But it was interesting. And, and so now I'm part of a church that does enter into Holy Week in a fashion that is kind of walking through Christ's last week of life.
Yeah.
And then you get to the end of that and it's the celebration of his resurrection. And, this was just a couple days ago for us. And I'm left with this, like, I've done it a couple times now. And it's just like, there's a little bit of a sadness now that season's over, even though I was like really ready to like not be fasting anymore. And all that stuff. But like now it's like, I miss it. And I feel like I really was like connected to the life of Christ.
Yeah.
And in a very real way, and experienced like the kingdom of heaven, in the present time. I lost concept or perception of like real time for a while there. Like when you asked me to think back on last week, it's like, it's just all just kind of one big blur.
Yeah.
Anyway, all of that to be said is that like shot through with meaning, right? And participation and transformation. Like it was impactful. I don't know how else to put it.
Yeah, words fail at some level when you've gone. And I think that's true about any life experience that we go through that radically influences us to the point of actually being worthy of being called transformative.
Yeah.
We struggle to describe it because it happens at a level that's at the heart and not the head. And so the head kind of sits there and goes, I don't know. I was talking with a youth group at one point about this idea of laughing or even crying. It's like, here is your body having this involuntary response to something, and your mind's like, why am I still laughing? What is this? And if you think about it, laughter specifically, it's one of these really weird things that just we experience, and we don't really understand why it's happening, but we also do understand why it's happening, just not in a rational sense. And so, that touches on this idea that these holidays, specifically if we talk about the lived experience of the Christian life, in conjunction with the rhythms, the liturgical rhythms, really, if you think about the liturgical calendar. And we did a reel on Instagram recently talking about the Annunciation, which is exactly 9 months prior to Christmas, December 25th, March 25th, exactly 9 months prior. The church, Christianity throughout the ages, has celebrated this day as the day of the beginning of our salvation, because it's the day that the Archangel Gabriel went to the Virgin Mary and said, you will bear the Christ child, which is actually the conception of Jesus, is what we celebrate. Now, of course, we don't know the exact dates that these things happen. We pick the dates that make the most sense historically, and those rhythms have been there for millennia. So, it's not about the specific date, but it's about what is it that we are actually recalling into not just our memory, but our lived reality, so that we can re-enter that and be transformed and impacted by it. It reminds me of the movie The Passion. When you watch that, it's one of those movies that I've intentionally not watched. And whether you love it or hate it or have opinions about Mel Gibson, whatever, it was very impactful in a way that was shocking at a lot of levels, but definitely brought a value to recognizing like what happened, to the degree of suffering and difficulty that was actually there. It's one of those movies that I think I've only watched it twice, but I've been very cautious to not become desensitized to, because I don't ever want that to just become something that's like, I'm desensitized to it. But this idea that these holidays, these holy days, specifically within Christianity, go throughout the entire calendar, surfacing moments within the life of Christ that have tremendous meaning and value to our transformation as we pursue following him. And, that's just aligns with the name of this channel. We want to find God in everything because he's in everything. And it's when we enter into those and allow them to actually impact us and influence us that we experience a transformative reality. But that only happens if we're living that practice. And it's when we get into our head too much that these holidays, they lose their deeper meaning, and they don't actually help us connect with the true meaning of life.
Yeah, it'd be hard for me to say that like my prior celebrating of Easter and Christmas was transformational.
Yeah.
At least not in a positive way.
No, totally. I mean, I can remember it being very lacking, because I was part of a faith confession where we would just come on a Sunday, and it was pretty much just like any other Sunday. maybe there were some different decorations. Maybe everyone was dressed up in pastel colors,
Right.
and there might be a cross that got rolled out on the stage, but there certainly wasn't anything deeper or more connected to my lived experience that challenged me in ways of, not getting sleep or giving up food or like whatever it was. It wasn't calling me to be something more than I already was.
Right.
It was a completely a mental exercise, really, or an emotional exercise. And beyond that, it didn't leave any lasting impact. I mean, it'd be like the next day, it was like, oh, yesterday was Easter. Oh, okay, well, or Christmas even feels that way oftentimes.
No, Christmas is over.
Yeah.
Cool. I
Yeah.
got stuff. I got a
Right.
bunch of things, and it's like, yeah, hey, cool. How was Christmas this year? Hey, man, I got a PlayStation 5, man. It was rad.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
Or whatever.
Yeah. Super exciting. And those things aren't wrong in and of themselves, but when, it gets back to that modern rant of the reason for the season, right? I mean, we can use that as a true thing to delve into and say, like, what is the reason we're doing any of these holidays? Like, do they even matter anymore? They're just these surface level, they're no longer holy days. And for it to be holy, set apart, and actually carry meaning, that's where transformation comes. But I think it really boils back down to this idea of what is the meaning of life. And if you haven't connected with the meaning of life in a Christian experience, then you're not understanding that it's all about taking up your cross, dying to self, denying yourself, becoming that living sacrifice for the sake of the other, which is to follow Christ in his example in the narrow gate, the way of becoming like him. These holidays are intentional markers to draw us into every aspect of Christ's life that is transformative, whether that's the transfiguration itself, whether that's the Annunciation, whether that's the baptism of Christ on Theophany, whether that's his crucifixion on Great and Holy Friday, whether that's his resurrection on Easter or Pascha. There's all of these different things that draw us deeper into it. But without that heart of meaning, we're left with an intellectual, just remember, oh yeah, that happened once. It's a good thing to keep in mind, but it's disconnected. Somehow it's like upstairs and we're downstairs. It's just in our head, but I'm dominating the conversation
No, it's
as
all
I well
good.
do.
I feel like I've said quite a bit myself. But yeah, I don't have a whole lot more on my mind concerning all that. I can say I have really benefited from discovering what it actually means to celebrate a quote unquote holy day, or a holiday or a festival, and to see that like, oh, this isn't just like a meaningless exercise. And I think people intuitively get that. Like the 4th of July is not just an arbitrary like celebration. We probably often forget exactly what we're doing there or why there's fireworks or things like that. But it does unify.
Yeah.
You see people out there and celebrating the birth of our country, who maybe the rest of the time don't like it so much or whatever,
Right.
So it does something.
Yeah.
And I think we can all recognize that.
Or even birthdays. I can remember growing up thinking that my birthday didn't really matter. I didn't really care. And I went through college. I can remember the first time that I was alone, away from my family, and my birthday happened, and there was no party, there was no cake, there was no nothing. And I realized how much it actually bothered me, how much I feel like I almost, I don't want to use the word blasphemed, but it felt blasphemous or sacrilegious to basically treat it like any other day.
It's just arbitrary.
There was something that died that day that I did not get to experience. And I think my wife is absolutely, and I think women tend to be more in tune with these things, in tune with the heart by default, generally speaking, than men do. We take a little bit more of a head approach to everything and struggle in that regard. But, my wife will be the first one to go above and beyond to try to make sure that certain practices or traditions or rhythms of life are observed and respected, and to make the cake at home instead of just run to the store and grab one and throw. It's not wrong to do any of those things, but the fact that she would put in the effort, the lived sacrifice, if you will, that she'd give her life, the hours it took to create that cake, imbues it with her and the meaning of it. She put herself into it. We talk about this when someone paints a painting. It's like they put themselves into that art.
Yeah.
That art becomes, it's why an original piece of art, unlike this one back here, if that was actually painted by the artist originally, it would have tremendous more value, not only in dollars, but the reason the dollars follow it is because there's actual value there that people perceive. Or if you took a baseball and you're like, this baseball, at first you're like, it's a baseball, but no, this was hit by Babe Ruth and caught by my great grandfather who was the outfielder that day or whatever. Like suddenly that baseball has tremendous value and meaning because of the human interactions that have happened with it.
Even though it's just
a baseball,
like any other baseball.
Right. Yeah. Or the American flag, to bring it back around to like July 4th, we can feel that anger and that pain when someone disrespects the flag, when they spit on it or they burn on it, because that flag has been imbued with the human experience it represents. It has become the very thing it represents, which is the true meaning of symbol. So in a way, I guess, we've almost come full circle and said that these holidays are lived manifestations of symbolic meaning.
Right.
Which symbolic in the true sense, not the sense that it's become somehow, it just represents, but that it actually has become the thing it represents. Well, I very much enjoyed my time speaking with Luke on this subject, and I hope to be able to do more of these episodes and have additional guests on in the future. If you enjoyed this, let us know. Leave a comment. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more content as it comes out. And we really do hope that you enjoyed this episode with Luke as we walked through holidays and their meaning and how they can be more transformative in our lives. If you've got additional questions, we'd love to hear from you, or topics that you'd like for us to cover. Feel free to leave those in the comments below and we will be in touch. Thank you so much, and remember to find God in everything that you do each and every day. We'll be praying for you. Please pray for us. Take care.